The road to Hollow Creek wasn't even marked on most maps. It wound through thick forests and barren fields, past abandoned houses with broken windows and overgrown yards, before it narrowed into a gravel path bordered by woods so dense that the sun barely touched the ground. The town itself looked ordinary at first, a scattering of homes, a few boarded-up shops, an old church leaning precariously. But visitors quickly learned that Hollow Creek was anything but normal. People around here didn't just avoid going out at night, they warned against it. The locals would shake their heads, eyes darting to the edges of town, and mutter about the shadows and the quiet ones that roamed after dark. No one knew exactly what that meant, but anyone who stayed long enough began to feel it, a creeping unease, as if the town itself were watching. Folks who moved to Hollow Creek hoping for a peaceful life soon found that peace was the last thing they'd get. It was on a cold, clear night in October when Claire Thomas moved into her new rental on the edge of town. The house was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but she didn't ask questions. It was supposed to be a fresh start, far from the city noise and stress. On her first night, as she unpacked in the dim living room, she heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside. She brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch against the side of the house. The sound returned the next night. Louder. Claire went to the window, expecting to see a stray cat or maybe a raccoon, but all she saw was darkness pressing against the glass, so thick it felt like a living thing. As her eyes adjusted, she swore she saw movement, just the faintest flicker, something shifting in the shadows near the tree line. A chill ran down her spine, but she told herself it was her imagination. Hollow Creek was just different from what she was used to. She'd adjust. The scratching continued each night, and then there was a low whispering like a voice carried on the wind. At first, she couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. It was pleading, desperate, as if someone were begging for help just out of sight. By the fourth night, Claire could barely sleep. She took to pacing the house with a flashlight, checking the locks over and over, feeling as though something was closing in on her. On the fifth night, she finally saw it. Or them. She had gone to the kitchen to grab a glass of water when she noticed movement outside. Her backyard opened into a stretch of trees, and there, standing at the edge of the woods, were figures. Several of them. They stood deathly still, barely visible in the moonlight, their shapes shifting like smoke but unmistakably human. Heart pounding, Claire watched as they lifted their arms, pointing directly at her house. She slammed the curtains shut, heart hammering, and stumbled backward. A sound reached her ears, a faint, muffled thump coming from the basement. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate, like someone knocking in a trance. She hadn't even known the house had a basement. Barely breathing, she crept down the narrow staircase, each step louder than the last. The air grew thick and cold, and the smell of damp earth filled her lungs. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a door, rusted, chained shut, with deep scratches gouged into the wood. She should have turned back, should have run, but something compelled her to reach out, her fingers grazing the cold metal chain. The scratching and whispering had stopped. The silence was deafening. As she stood there, the air grew heavier, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. She could feel something on the other side of the door, something that had been waiting, something that had known she would come. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and the chain snapped, the door swinging open with a groan. The darkness beyond the door was thick and oily, moving like a living thing. And then, out of the shadows, she saw them, the figures from the backyard. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken and dark, mouths hanging open in silent screams. They shuffled forward, their hands reaching out, skeletal fingers brushing against her face. Claire stumbled backward, falling onto the floor, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. The figures closed in, their fingers ice cold as they gripped her arms, her legs. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the suffocating blackness. And then she heard it, the whispering, close, right next to her ear. Stay with us, forever. Hours later, when she didn't show up for her job in town, a few locals went to check on her. They found the house empty, all her belongings left untouched, as if she had simply vanished. Her car was still in the driveway, her keys on the kitchen counter. Over the years, others came and went from that house, each time drawn by the cheap rent, the promise of a quiet life in the country. and each time they would disappear. The townsfolk would shake their heads, muttering about the shadows and the quiet ones who claimed the town after dark. To this day, if you drive through Hollow Creek on a cold, clear night, you might catch a glimpse of her, standing at the edge of the woods, her mouth open in a silent scream, reaching out to warn you away. But by then, it's usually too late. Late one autumn night, as thick fog rolled over the small town of Ash Hollow, the residents huddled inside their homes, shutting windows and locking doors tight. Those who had lived there long enough knew to avoid the streets when the fog settled in thick, curling tendrils through every crevice and alley. Folks told stories, legends they called them, about strange things that happened in the mist, things that defied explanation and reason. Some said that once the fog came, something else came with it. Something that only those unlucky enough to be caught outside would ever encounter. One such night, 17-year-old Daniel Thompson decided he'd had enough of his father's warnings and his mother's superstitions. He was just out with his friends, nothing unusual, and he didn't want to cut the night short just because of some fog. His friends didn't seem too keen, mumbling nervously about the mist and the stories that went with it. But Daniel laughed it off and left them behind, heading home through the empty streets alone. The town was silent, quieter than usual, with the only sound being his own footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. As he walked, the mist grew thicker, swirling around his ankles, crawling up his legs until he could hardly see more than a few feet in any direction. He shrugged his jacket closer and picked up his pace, feeling the eerie isolation press in on him. Then he noticed it. A faint sound, just on the edge of hearing, like footsteps following his own. He stopped, and the noise stopped with him. Heart pounding, he took a few steps forward, and there it was again, just a little too close. The hairs on his arms stood on end as he felt a heavy presence watching him from the shadows. Every instinct told him to run, but his feet were glued to the ground, rooted in a paralyzing fear. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely more than a whisper in the thick fog. No answer. The silence pressed down on him, heavy, unyielding. And then, just ahead in the fog, he saw it. A figure, its shape barely human, shifting in and out of the mist like smoke. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs stretched too long, moving slowly toward him. He could barely make out its face, but he knew that it was looking at him, its eyes piercing through the darkness. As it drew closer, he could see its mouth. It was wide and unnatural, stretched into a chilling smile that seemed to grow wider the closer it got, revealing rows of jagged, impossibly sharp teeth. It whispered his name, soft and lilting, as if tasting the sound. Daniel's pulse raced. He felt trapped, unable to look away from its eyes, which seemed to fill his vision, swallowing him whole. Suddenly, he heard his mother's voice, distant but clear, calling his name. The sound broke his trance, and he stumbled backward, desperate to escape. The figure reached out, its long fingers stretching toward him, almost brushing his shoulder. His mother's voice grew louder, sharper, as she called for him again, and the thing in the mist froze. For a brief, terrifying moment, Daniel thought he saw more shapes moving in the fog, shapes with faces twisted in agony, their hands outstretched, reaching for help that would never come. With a jolt of terror, Daniel turned and ran, his feet pounding against the pavement as the whispering grew louder, layering upon itself in a chorus of despair. He didn't look back, even when he heard footsteps pounding behind him, even when he felt hot breath on his neck. He sprinted all the way home, slamming the door shut and collapsing against it, his body shaking. His parents found him there in the morning, his face pale, eyes wide, clutching his knees. He didn't say a word about what he saw, but he refused to go out after dark from that day on. His friends would joke about it, try to coax him into night trips, but he would only shake his head, eyes darting to the windows. Years later, he left Ash Hollow, hoping to escape the memories of that fog-filled night. But he would never truly leave it behind. Sometimes when the fog was thick and the night was still, he would hear his name whispered, soft and lilting, like something calling from far away. He knew he wasn't safe, not really. Not while the mist still lingered over Ash Hollow, carrying with it the memories of the lost and the lingering whispers of those who would never leave. There's an old town hidden deep in the woods of northern Maine that doesn't appear on maps, a town so secluded that even seasoned hikers and hunters rarely speak of it. Locals call it Hawthorne Pines. a name whispered only by those who know what it means. Visitors who stumble upon Hawthorne Pines leave with stories they'd rather forget, if they're lucky enough to leave at all. One November evening, a young man named Luke set out on a solo camping trip. He was an experienced outdoorsman, used to Maine's harsh winters and wild terrain. He'd heard whispers about Hawthorne Pines, but he dismissed the tales as nothing more than local superstition. After 2 days in the dense woods, he found an overgrown path leading to what looked like the remains of a small town. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed the trail to the outskirts of Hawthorne Pines. It was as if time had forgotten the place. The houses were old, their wooden frames bowed and splintered, their windows shattered, roofs caved in. He could feel an unsettling stillness in the air, a silence so profound it seemed to press on his eardrums. As the sun dipped below the trees, he noticed something odd. There were no signs of animals, no birds in the trees, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. A strange sense of unease crept up his spine, but he told himself it was just the eeriness of the abandoned town. He walked deeper into the heart of Hawthorne Pines, where he found a large, rotting mansion at the center. Its windows stared at him like hollow eyes, and its front door hung slightly open. Against his better judgment, Luke pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust coated every surface, and the air was stale, thick with decay. As he explored, he found strange things. A child's doll sitting on a rocking chair, its eyes scratched out, a faded family portrait with faces blurred as if someone had tried to scrub them out. He was about to leave when he heard a faint sound coming from the second floor. It was a soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps pacing back and forth. He froze, every instinct telling him to run, but curiosity held him in place. Slowly, he crept up the stairs, his heart pounding with every step. At the top of the staircase, he found a long hallway lined with doors. The creaking grew louder, coming from a room at the end. The door was ajar, and as he approached, he could see a flicker of light coming from inside, like the glow of a candle. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single rocking chair in the center, slowly moving back and forth, though there was no one there to push it. On the wall in front of the chair, words were scrawled in black, jagged letters. "They never leave." Before he could react, a soft whisper filled the room. It started as a low murmur, but then it grew louder, echoing around him, repeating the same phrase over and over. "They never leave. They never leave." He backed away, heart racing. But as he turned, he saw something in the doorway. A figure, tall and thin, with empty, hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. It grinned at him, a wide, lipless smile that sent chills through his body. Luke stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the rocking chair, and bolted out of the room. The whispers followed him, growing louder, as if the house itself was chanting. He raced down the stairs and out the front door, not daring to look back. As he sprinted through the streets, he saw shadows moving in the windows of other houses, figures watching him with that same hollow-eyed stare. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the town, where he collapsed, gasping for breath. When he finally looked back, Hawthorne Pines was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. It was as if the town had vanished, leaving no trace of its eerie existence. Luke never spoke of what he saw that night, but the experience haunted him. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing those words whispered in the dark. "They never leave. They never leave." He moved far from Maine, hoping distance would silence the memories, but the whispers followed him. And sometimes, late at night, he would feel a chill wash over him, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. He'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, a hollow-eyed figure with a wide, lipless grin, and he'd realize the truth. Hawthorne Pines had never left him, and it never would. When the snow blanketed the town of Black Hollow, the locals locked their doors and drew their curtains tight. Snow fell there differently, thicker, colder, like it carried secrets of things buried deep and forgotten. Children learned early to fear the first snowfall of winter, and parents never spoke of what happened to those who ignored the warning. One winter, a woman named Sarah moved to Black Hollow. She was new to town, unaware of the whispered tales about the snow that never melted, even in the spring. She'd taken a job as a school teacher, seeking a quiet life away from the city. The townsfolk were polite but distant, and she often caught them watching her with a wary look. One day, as she was unpacking her things, an elderly neighbor came to her door with a warning. "Don't go out when the first snow falls," she said, her voice shaking. "Stay inside. Lock your doors and cover your windows." Sarah nodded politely, but she couldn't help feeling the woman was just another superstitious small-town local. That night, as the snow began to fall, Sarah watched it from her window, marveling at the way it seemed to glow faintly in the dark. As she stood there, mesmerized, she felt a strange pull to go outside, to walk through the fresh snow and see the town under the moonlight. The pull was too strong to resist, and against her better judgment, Sarah put on her coat and stepped outside. The air was silent, the snow muffling every sound, as if she'd stepped into another world entirely. She walked through the deserted streets, her footsteps the only trace of life in the snow-covered town. The snowflakes drifted down like ashes, and the deeper she went, the quieter the world became. As she turned a corner, she noticed something unusual. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading away from the town square toward the forest at the edge of town. They were small, like a child's, and her heart twisted with concern. What would a child be doing out in the snow this late? Without thinking, she followed the tracks, her footsteps silent and soft as she moved deeper into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow, casting long shadows across her path. She followed the tracks until they disappeared abruptly at their ending in the middle of a small clearing. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides, and a strange, prickling sensation crept up her spine. She was about to turn back when she heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle that echoed through the trees. It sounded close, too close. She spun around, searching the darkness, but saw nothing. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The giggle came again, this time from behind her. She whipped around, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a small figure, a child dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes were wide and dark, almost too large for his face, and his skin had a bluish tint, like he'd been out in the cold far too long. "Are you lost?" Sarah asked, taking a step forward, but the child only stared at her, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. Then, slowly, he lifted his arm and pointed toward the trees behind her. Sarah turned to look and felt her heart stop. Shadows were gathering between the trees, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. They moved slowly, their bodies jerking with unnatural, twisted movements. They seemed to float just above the snow, leaving no footprints, their faces shrouded in darkness. She stumbled backward, her breath fogging in the freezing air as the figures drew closer, surrounding her. The child giggled again, his laughter sharp and shrill, echoing through the clearing as the shadows moved in. "Run!" the child whispered, his voice hollow and mocking. Sarah turned and bolted, her feet slipping on the icy ground as she fled back toward town. She could hear the soft, crunching sounds of snow behind her, feel the cold breath of the shadows at her back pressing in, closer and closer. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down, her only thought to reach her house, her sanctuary. She finally burst through her front door, slamming it shut and locking it tight. Her heart hammered in her chest as she pressed her back against the door, panting, waiting, listening. But all was silent once more. She went to the window, pulling back the curtain ever so slightly, and gasped. In the snow outside her house, she saw them, the figures, standing still, watching her with those empty, hollow eyes. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the snow, waiting. The child was among them, smiling up at her with that strange, cold grin. And as she watched, horrified, he lifted his hand and waved. Sarah spent the rest of the winter inside, her curtains drawn, her doors locked. She never ventured out into the snow again. The townsfolk noticed the change in her, but no one asked why. They already knew. Spring came, and the snow finally began to melt. But in the clearing at the edge of the forest where Sarah had followed the tracks that night, the snow remained, untouched, unmelted. And if anyone dared to look, they could still see faint footprints in the snow. Small, child-sized prints that led into the heart of the woods and ended in the middle of the clearing. Sarah left Black Hollow as soon as the snow thawed, abandoning her house and her job, leaving without a word. But even far from Black Hollow, in the quiet of the night, she would hear it, that faint, high-pitched giggle echoing in her dreams, haunting her every time winter came. And deep down, she knew. No matter where she went, the child and his shadowed friends would be waiting. The village of Briarwood had a reputation that stretched back generations. Nestled in a hollow between two dense forests, it was an isolated place, with a history of strange disappearances that the villagers rarely spoke of. At the edge of town stood an old, crumbling inn called the Hollow's Rest, once a popular stop for travelers, now abandoned and avoided by the locals. It was said that anyone who spent a night in the Hollow's Rest would never leave Briarwood. They called it the Inn with no checkout, and the few brave souls who dared spend the night claimed to have experienced terrifying visions, only to leave before midnight, their faces pale and voices shaking. One winter, a man named Edward Hensley arrived in Briarwood. He was a writer, drawn to the village by tales of hauntings and mysterious disappearances, hoping to find inspiration for his next novel. When he heard about the Hollow's Rest, he was intrigued. An inn haunted by spirits? It sounded perfect. Despite the townsfolk's warnings, Edward decided to stay the night, convinced it would be nothing more than a story to add to his book. He arrived at the inn just before dusk. The building loomed above him, dark and foreboding, its wooden exterior rotting and covered in ivy. The windows were cracked and clouded, and the door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint scent of mildew and something else, a metallic tang he couldn't quite place. The lobby was empty, dust thick on every surface as if the inn had been abandoned for years. But there was something unsettling about the silence, an almost tangible tension in the air, as if someone or something were watching him. He found a room on the second floor, a small space with a single bed and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The wallpaper was peeling, and cobwebs hung in the corners. There was an old guest book on the bedside table, its pages yellowed and brittle. He flipped through it out of curiosity, and a chill ran down his spine as he read the last few entries. Each one ended with the same phrase, "I didn't make it." He closed the book, telling himself it was just a creepy addition left by someone looking to play up the inn's haunted reputation. As the evening wore on, he unpacked his things, lit a candle, and settled in to write, hoping to get some work done before the night was over. It started around midnight, a faint whisper so soft he almost missed it. It drifted through the walls, barely audible, as if someone were murmuring in the room next door. Edward brushed it off, telling himself it was just the wind. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, and soon it was joined by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing up and down the hall outside his door. He put down his pen, his pulse quickening. The inn was supposed to be empty. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but the footsteps continued, echoing through the air as if someone were walking just out of sight. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely a whisper. The footsteps stopped. He waited, straining to hear, and that's when he noticed something strange. The wallpaper on the far wall seemed to be moving, shifting as if something were crawling beneath it. He took a step closer, heart hammering, and watched in horror as dark, shadowy shapes began to emerge from behind the wallpaper, pressing outward as if they were trying to escape. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with desperate, pleading voices, each one overlapping the next. "Help me. Please, I didn't mean to stay. Get out while you can." Edward stumbled backward, his mind racing. He turned to run back into his room, but when he looked down the hallway, he saw them. Figures, pale and thin, their eyes hollow and empty, shuffling slowly toward him. Their clothes were ragged, and their faces twisted in expressions of agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Each one reached out a hand, fingers clawing at the air as they came closer. Panicking, Edward rushed back into his room and slammed the door, his hands shaking as he locked it. But the whispers were inside the room now, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. The mirror on the wall flickered, and as he looked, he saw himself reflected in the glass. But something was wrong. His reflection stared back at him, but its eyes were empty, dark pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't match his own. It raised a hand, pointing directly at him, and he realized with horror that he couldn't move. It was as if something had taken control of his body, freezing him in place, forcing him to watch. The whispers grew louder, and he felt a strange sensation, like ice crawling over his skin, spreading through his veins. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his reflection grinning wider, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to go on forever. Days passed before anyone noticed Edward was missing. The townsfolk found his car parked outside the inn, but inside there was no sign of him. The only thing they found was the guest book, left open on the bedside table, with a new entry scrawled in shaky handwriting, "I didn't make it." Years went by, and the Hollow's Rest remained abandoned, its windows dark and empty. But locals say that if you pass by on a cold winter's night, you can see figures standing in the windows, staring out with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. And sometimes, if the wind is just right, you'll hear a whisper drifting through the air. "I didn't mean to stay."